Okay, a video on what is the purpose of an interpreter. Well, for many people, language and culture, these differences become a significant barrier to accessing quality healthcare. These patients that I'm speaking of are called LEP patients or limited English proficient patients. Okay, so in the industry, as an interpreter, you're gonna, for the rest of your career, hear of the patients that we assist as LEP patients, limited English proficient. Now, there's a difference between an interpreter who's trained and one who's untrained. So, an interpreter who is untrained is known as an ad hoc interpreter. So, you taking this class now, if you've ever interpreted for someone, a family member, or maybe a volunteering at a clinic, you were considered an ad hoc interpreter, someone who is filling a role as an interpreter but who is untrained. So, who else are ad hoc interpreters? Well, any family member that tries to interpret for their family member, that is the patient, a child that's being asked to help. It could even be someone that works in the clinic or the hospital that speaks a language that the patient speaks, but is not trained as an interpreter. Okay, so yeah, briefly defining that, an ad hoc interpreter is someone who is untrained. And a trained interpreter is, well, by definition, someone who is trained. But let's go ahead and talk about the differences. So, to be a medical interpreter requires a great deal of skill, more than just speaking two languages. Um, this skill allows interpreters to facilitate effective communication. So, you're able to assess possible cultural bumps or misunderstandings because you're aware of, the biomedical culture. You're aware of the medicine in the United States. You're aware of how the hospital is situated here or how it is run, as opposed to the countries where the patients that you are helping are from. So you have a greater knowledge of what their misunderstandings are based on your experience and based on your training, which is what you're receiving today. Okay, let's go into what is well, first, one last thing. Who are trained interpreters? Well, they're staff interpreters who are certified, who are qualified. They could be QBE, qualified bilingual employees, such as they are an MA, but they took the medical interpreting course and they're now technically an interpreter as well, but they have dual roles. Also, gig interpreters, um, known as contract interpreters, agency interpreters, independent contractors, all the same thing. Basically, you work for yourself. You're a small business that contracts with agencies to perform work. Okay? All right, moving on. The purpose of an interpreter is to facilitate understanding and communication between people who are speaking different languages. That is our goal. Now let's break that up. Facilitate understanding and communication between people who are speaking different languages. Well, facilitation means that the interpreter is active. We're not passive, so we're not just there innocent bystanders just repeating a message. We are active in trying to ensure that all parties are understanding. If there's a cultural difference, if there's a misunderstanding, we're jumping in trying to facilitate that. Once again, understanding. The interpreter's goal is not simply to repeat words, but to ensure that the message was understood. We're looking for understanding. We're looking for facial cues if they don't understand to then clarify. All right. Communication, this implies that there's an exchange of information between the patient and the provider. And speaking, we are not translators. We are interpreters. We work with the spoken or manual languages if you are an ASL interpreter. All right. You know what? There's one thing I wanted to mention before we end this video. We see the definition of what an interpreter is right here. Nowhere in that definition does it say, also, interpreters are social workers, or interpreters are the emotional support system of the patient, or the interpreter is a bridge to the English-speaking community outside the hospital. We don't see that. Do we see anywhere here where it says the interpreter guarantees a good medical outcome, or that the guarantees that all parties will be happy with the appointment? No, that is not our role. We are not the social worker, right? With advocacy, which we'll talk about at a later time, advocacy takes special skill and mature judgment. But we are not the social worker. We are not the patient's emotional support system, no matter how tragic their condition is, or if they have no friends here and they just need someone to talk to. We need to remain impartial at all times. We cannot be someone's emotional support system. We are not an interpreter of the world. We don't interpret for everything. We are medical interpreters based in the hospital. We do not give our phone numbers out to be used as interpreters on the outside. Um, you all have had doctors that you don't care for. Why don't you care for that doctor? Well, maybe because they didn't pay attention to you. They didn't give you the time of day. They misdiagnosed you. They weren't kind. They were quick or rude. Just because an interpreter is there doesn't mean that the doctor is going to be a better doctor, okay? We cannot ensure that everyone will be happy or that the outcome will be good, okay? Our purpose is simply to facilitate understanding and communication between people who are speaking different languages. My goal as an interpreter is to make it so that it's the same quality care that an English-speaking patient is receiving. So if I can take language and culture out of the mix, out of the barrier, I've done my job. Okay? This is the end to our video for the purpose of an interpreter. If you have further questions, we'll ask them in class.